All right, today we are tackling a really big, really complex idea, the concept of Greater Israel. It's a term that starts in ancient scripture, but believe me, it has a massive impact on modern borders, on modern conflict. And if you want to understand the region today, you really have to understand this idea.
So let's just ask it straight up. What is Greater Israel? Well, one thing's for sure. You're not going to find it on any modern map. It's not a country. It's an idea. It's a vision. And it's one that people have been debating and honestly fighting over for a very, very long time. And here's what's absolutely key. There is no single, simple definition. The term has meant totally different things to different people throughout history. For some, it's a spiritual homeland. For others, it's a historical kingdom they want to reclaim. And for some, it's a modern political goal for expanding territory. Okay, so take a look at this. This map shows the most ambitious, the most maximalist version of the idea. It comes from a biblical promise made to Abraham, and it describes a massive territory stretching all the way from the Nile River in Egypt to the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq and Syria. It is a huge vision, but like we're about to see, it's just one of many ways this has been interpreted. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dig into the idea's ancient roots in religious texts. Then we'll see how modern Zionism grabbed that idea and turned it into a political goal. We'll follow the story through Israel's creation and that game-changing 1967 war, and finally, we'll look at where this idea stands right now in the middle of today's contested reality. To really get this, we have to go way, way back. The whole concept of Greater Israel doesn't start with politicians or modern maps. It begins with ancient scripture. The idea of a specific, divinely promised land is right at the heart of the Hebrew Bible. And what's really fascinating here is that even the Bible doesn't give you one clear-cut map. In Genesis, you get this huge, sweeping territory promised to Abraham's descendants. But then in the book of Numbers, it describes a much more defined, narrower piece of land for the 12 tribes. And then Deuteronomy kind of suggests it's a land that would be given out piece by piece over time. So no single answer. This verse right here, this is the big one. This is the most famous, the most expansive definition you'll find. It's the basis for that huge map we just saw, and it's the verse that has been used again and again by religious and political figures to argue for the most far-reaching claims to the land. But okay, here's a super important reality check. There was often a big difference between the divinely promised land in the texts and the actual historical land that ancient kingdoms like David and Solomon's really controlled. That biblical ideal was often an aspiration, not always the reality on the ground. All right, let's fast forward a couple of thousand years. How does this ancient religious idea get picked up, dusted off, and completely reshaped by Zionism, which was a modern political movement that kicked off in the late 1800s? This is from Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of modern Zionism. And right there in his own diary, he's laying out a vision that directly links his new political project to the ancient memory of those Israelite kingdoms. You can see how that biblical story was being turned into a modern political slogan. But look, early Zionism was not one big unified movement, not at all. Two major camps quickly emerged with very different ideas. You had labor Zionism, which was the main group. They were pragmatic. They were willing to accept a smaller, partitioned land just to get a state off the ground. But then you had revisionist Zionism. Their whole thing was territorial maximalism. They insisted on Jewish control over all of British Mandate Palestine, which even included what we now call Jordan. And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures that pragmatic mindset. You've got David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, saying, yeah, okay, we'll accept partition for now. But he saw it as just a strategic first step. A state on part of the land was a potent lever to, in his words, eventually redeem the whole country. The long-term vision was still there. So this big ideological clash, it all comes to a boiling point in 1948. The British Mandate is ending, the State of Israel is about to be declared, and this new nation has to make a very real choice about where its borders are going to be. And this is so important to grasp. From day one, literally from the moment of its birth, the State of Israel had this fundamental argument baked right into its politics. The party in power accepted the UN's partition plan. But the opposition, the revisionists, who are the direct ancestors of today's Likud party, they were holding out for that bigger dream of the whole land of Israel. So for about 2 decades, that debate was mostly just, well, a debate. It was ideological. But then came 1967. And one single event, the Six-Day War, changed everything and brought the idea of a greater Israel roaring back to the forefront. I mean, Israel's military victory was just stunning. All of a sudden, it was in control of the biblical heartlands of Judea and Samaria, what we call the West Bank, plus Gaza and other areas. For a lot of religious nationalists, this felt like biblical prophecy was literally coming true before their eyes, and it completely upended the political landscape. And this wasn't just talk. This victory immediately led to action. The movement for Greater Israel popped up, demanding that the government start settling these new territories. And then came Gush Emunim, or the Bloc of the Faithful, a really powerful religious settler movement that just started building settlements all across the West Bank, sometimes even when the government told them not to. So what's the result on the ground today? Well, the number is staggering. More than half a century later, there are now over 650,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That reality, which was born from the ideology that exploded back in 1967, is now one of the single most defining factors of the entire conflict. So that brings us right up to the present day, and what we see is that an idea that was once kind of on the political and religious fringes, well, it's not on the fringes anymore. It has moved straight into the mainstream, right to the center of Israeli power. And just to see how dramatically things have shifted, think about this. It wasn't that long ago, 2008, when a prime minister from the Likud party, the very party of the revisionists, said publicly that the idea of Greater Israel was over, a delusion. That was a time when the two-state solution was really the main framework for any peace talks. But fast forward to today, and it is a complete 180. Here you have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly calling his job a historic and spiritual mission to secure Greater Israel. He says he's very attached to that vision. The idea that was once called a delusion is now a stated mission from the very top. And what's really telling is this isn't just coming from the ruling coalition. Even centrist opposition leaders are now using the Bible as a mandate for Israel's borders. And that signals a much, much bigger political shift where this language of religious destiny and biblical claims is just becoming normal across the board. So you have the political talk, right? But it's also being backed up by the physical reality on the ground. Decades of nonstop settlement building have created what a lot of experts now just call a one-state reality. The land is so tangled up, so intertwined, that the idea of neatly separating it into two states just seems more and more impossible to a lot of people. And that leaves us with this huge, final, critical question. The idea of Greater Israel isn't some ancient story anymore. It's not a fringe belief. It is actively shaping the ground we walk on and the politics of today. So, with the possibility of two states fading fast, the completely unresolved question is, what will define the final borders of this land? And what happens to all the people who live within them? That is the question that's more urgent now than ever before.